Beyond the camera's gaze and across the invisible lines of history lies the untold truth. Prepare to witness the extraordinary events and pivotal moments that fundamentally reshaped our modern world.
Evening, sir. Go ahead and step away from the car for me. You're on private property here.
This is my driveway. I just pulled in.
Okay, I need to see some identification, please.
Why? Why are you stopping me at my own house?
Because right now you're trespassing. Give me your ID so we can clear this up.
I'm not trespassing. I live here. I don't have to hand you anything.
Sir, I'm giving you a lawful order. If you refuse to identify yourself, you'll be arrested for obstruction.
Officer Travis Reed saw a black man pulling into the driveway of an expensive home in an upscale gated community and immediately assumed he didn't belong there. He activated his lights, blocked the driveway, and confronted the man with accusations of trespassing and driving a suspicious vehicle. When the man, 48-year-old Byron Tate, refused to immediately show identification and questioned why he was being stopped in his own driveway, Reed threatened him with arrest for obstruction. What Officer Travis Reed didn't know, what he was about to discover, was that the black man was the HOA president of the neighborhood, and that he had just illegally detained and attempted to arrest the most powerful resident in the community, that his racially motivated stop had been captured on high-definition cameras, and that his decision to profile a black homeowner without cause would cost him his badge and result in a $1.4 million settlement that would become a landmark case on racial profiling in affluent communities. Before we go further, what city or country are you watching from? Drop it in the comments. We love seeing where you're tuning in from. And if you believe a black man should be able to pull into his own driveway without being accused of trespassing, like this video and subscribe. Brookstone Estates was the kind of gated community where home prices started at $800,000 and went up from there, where the landscaping was professionally maintained year-round, and where the Homeowners Association had strict rules about everything from fence colors to the types of trees you could plant in your yard. The community sat on 150 acres of pristine property with wide streets, decorative street lamps, and houses that looked like they belonged in architecture magazines. Security was taken seriously here, which is why the HOA board had recently approved a $180,000 investment in a comprehensive security camera system that covered every entrance, every street corner, and every common area with high-definition cameras that recorded video and audio 24 hours a day. Byron Tate had been the one to champion that security system. He was 48 years old, a senior vice president at a financial consulting firm where he had worked for the past 23 years, and he had lived in Brookstone Estates for 12 years with his wife Angela and their 2 children, who were now both away at college. Byron had been elected president of the HOA board 6 years ago, and he had been re-elected every year since because he was organized, fair, and genuinely cared about making the community a better place to live. He had overseen improvements to the community pool, negotiated better rates for landscaping services, and most recently had spent 6 months researching security camera systems before presenting his recommendation to the board and getting unanimous approval for the installation. The cameras had gone live exactly 2 weeks ago, and Byron had personally walked every street in the community with the installation crew to verify that the coverage was comprehensive and that the image quality met the specifications he had required. The system was the state-of-the-art, with cameras that could capture license plates from 50 feet away and facial features from even farther. Every camera fed into a secure server that the HOA board had access to, and the footage was stored for 90 days before being automatically deleted, unless flagged for review. That Tuesday evening, Byron was driving home from work in his black Mercedes S-Class sedan, the same car he had owned for 3 years and that his neighbors had seen hundreds of times. He had left the office later than usual because of a client meeting that ran long, and by the time he pulled up to the security gate at the entrance to Brookstone Estates, it was nearly 7:30 and the sun was starting to set. He waved at the guard in the gatehouse, a man named Robert, who had worked there for 5 years and knew Byron by name. And Robert opened the gate without even asking for identification because Byron's car was registered in the system and his face was familiar. Byron drove through the gate and took the winding route through the community toward his house, which sat on a cul-de-sac near the back of the neighborhood. His home was a 5-bedroom colonial with white siding, black shutters, and a 3-car garage that faced the street. The front yard had mature oak trees that provided shade in the summer, and Angela had spent years cultivating flower beds that bloomed in rotation from spring through fall. It was a beautiful house, and Byron had worked hard to afford it. As Byron turned onto his street and approached his driveway, he noticed a police cruiser parked along the curb about 3 houses down from his. The HOA had a contract with the local police department to provide regular patrols through the community as an additional layer of security, and it wasn't unusual to see patrol cars driving through or parked in the neighborhood. Byron didn't think much of it as he activated his turn signal and started to pull into his driveway. But the moment Byron's car entered the driveway, The police cruiser's lights came on and the car pulled forward and turned sharply to block the driveway entrance behind Byron's Mercedes. Byron stopped his car halfway up the driveway and looked in his rearview mirror. The patrol car was positioned so that Byron couldn't back out, and a police officer was getting out of the driver's seat and walking toward Byron's car with a purposeful stride that immediately put Byron on edge. Byron put his car in park, left the engine running, and rolled down his window as the officer approached. The officer stopped at Byron's window and Byron could see his nameplate, Officer T. Reed. Officer Travis Reed was 36 years old with 8 years on the force, and over those 8 years he had developed a set of assumptions about who belonged in neighborhoods like Brookstone Estates and who didn't. Reed had been assigned to patrol the community for the past 3 months as part of the HOA's contract with the police department, and during those 3 months he had made it his personal mission to question anyone who looked out of place in the neighborhood. In Reed's mind, shaped by years of bias that had never been challenged or corrected, a black man driving a luxury car in an expensive white neighborhood was automatically suspicious. Reed looked at Byron through the car window and his tone was immediately confrontational. "Step out of the vehicle. I need to ask you some questions." Byron looked at Reed and felt a familiar tightness in his chest that came from years of knowing that interactions like this could go wrong very quickly if he didn't stay calm. "Officer, is there a problem? This is my house. I live here." Reed's expression didn't change. "I said step out of the vehicle. Now." Byron didn't move. "I'd like to know why you stopped me. I haven't committed any traffic violation. I just pulled into my own driveway." Reed's hand moved to rest on his service weapon and his voice got harder. "You're in a gated community driving a vehicle that doesn't belong here. I'm investigating a possible trespassing situation. Now step out of the car or you're going to be arrested for obstruction." Byron felt anger rising but kept his voice level. "Officer, this is my house. I've lived here for 12 years. I'm not trespassing. And I'm not getting out of my car until you tell me what legal basis you have for stopping me." Reed stepped closer to the window. "I don't need to explain myself to you. I'm a police officer conducting an investigation. You either comply or you're under arrest. Your choice." Byron stared at Reed for a long moment, weighing his options. He knew his rights. He knew that Reed had no probable cause for this stop, but he also knew that refusing to comply could escalate the situation into something dangerous. He had seen too many news stories about black men being shot or beaten during traffic stops for resisting or failing to comply, and he wasn't willing to risk his life to make a point. Byron reached slowly into his center console and pulled out his wallet. He extracted his driver's license and handed it through the window to Reed. "Here's my license. It shows my address. This house, 847 Magnolia Lane. The address is right there on the license." Reed took the license and looked at it, and his expression showed skepticism rather than acknowledgement. "This could be fake. How do I know you didn't make this?" Byron's voice stayed calm, but his frustration was building. "It's a state-issued driver's license. It's not fake, and if you run it through your system, you'll see it's valid." Reed held the license in his hand but didn't make any move to call it in or verify it through dispatch. Instead, he looked at Byron and said, "Registration and proof of insurance, now." Byron reached into his glove compartment and pulled out the vehicle registration and his insurance card. He handed both documents to Reed. "Everything is in order. My name, my address, my car. All of it matches." Reed looked at the documents and instead of verifying them, he shook his head. "These don't prove anything. Anyone can print documents. I think you're lying about living here, and I think you're driving a stolen vehicle." Byron's patience was reaching its limit. "Officer, you have my license, my registration, and my insurance. Everything matches. You can verify all of this in less than 2 minutes by calling it in. But you're not doing that. You're just standing here accusing me of crimes I haven't committed." Reed's face flushed red. "I don't need to call anything in. I know what I'm looking at, and what I'm looking at is someone who doesn't belong in this neighborhood." Reed reached for his handcuffs and pulled them off his belt. "You're under arrest for trespassing and providing false information to a police officer. Get out of the car, now." Byron felt his heart pounding. "You're arresting me? For what? I haven't done anything wrong." Reed opened Byron's car door and grabbed his arm. "Out, now, or I'll drag you out." Byron got out of the car slowly, his hands visible, his movements deliberate. Reed spun him around and pushed him against the side of the Mercedes, pulling Byron's arms behind his back. And that's when Byron said the words that would change everything. "Officer Reed, before you put those handcuffs on me, there's something you should know." Reed paused, the handcuffs in his hands. "What?" Byron's voice was calm, cold, and absolutely certain. "I'm the president of the Brookstone Estates Homeowners Association. I've lived in this community for 12 years. And 2 weeks ago, I personally oversaw the installation of a comprehensive security camera system throughout this entire neighborhood. High-definition cameras with audio. They're positioned at every street corner, every entrance, and throughout all common areas. Reed's hands stopped moving. Byron continued, and those cameras are recording this conversation right now. Every word you've said, every accusation you've made, every moment you violated my rights, it's all on camera. And as HOA president, I have full access to that footage. Reed's face went pale. His grip on Byron's arms loosened. Byron kept talking. You stopped me in my own driveway without probable cause. You accused me of trespassing in my own home. You refused to verify my identification even though I provided everything you asked for. And you were about to arrest me for crimes I didn't commit. All of it is documented. All of it is evidence. Reed let go of Byron's arms and took a step back. His voice came out shaky. I was just doing my job. I was investigating. Byron turned around to face him. You were racially profiling me, and now it's on camera. And now you're going to leave my property before you make this any worse for yourself. Reed stood there for a moment, his face showing a mixture of panic and realization. Then he turned, walked quickly back to his patrol car, got in, and drove away without another word. Byron stood in his driveway watching the patrol car disappear around the corner. Then he pulled out his phone and called his attorney. Byron Tate walked into his house and went straight to his home office, where he logged into the security camera system on his computer. The system interface showed a grid of camera feeds from throughout Brookstone Estates, and Byron navigated to the cameras that covered his street and his driveway. He found the footage from 30 minutes earlier and pressed play. The video quality was exactly as good as the installation company had promised. The camera, mounted on the street lamp across from Byron's house, had captured everything in perfect detail. Byron watched himself pull into his driveway. He watched Officer Travis Reed activate his lights and block the driveway. He watched Reed approach his car with his hand on his weapon. And most importantly, the audio was crystal clear. Every word Reed had said was recorded. Byron listened to Reed accusing him of trespassing. He listened to Reed threatening arrest for obstruction. He listened to Reed calling his driver's license fake and dismissing his registration as suspicious. And he listened to Reed refusing to verify any of the information through dispatch before pulling out handcuffs and attempting to arrest him. Byron saved the footage to 3 different locations, made backup copies, and then called his attorney. Michael Santos had been Byron's lawyer for 8 years, handling everything from real estate transactions to contract reviews, and he also had experience with civil rights cases. Michael answered on the second ring. Byron, what's going on? Byron explained what had just happened, speaking carefully and precisely so Michael would understand the full scope of the situation. When Byron finished, there was a long pause on the other end of the line. You have video of all of this? Michael asked. Every second. Multiple angles. High definition. Audio is clear. Michael's voice got serious. Send it to me right now, and don't talk to anyone else about this until we've reviewed everything. This is a textbook case of racial profiling, unlawful detention, and attempted false arrest. If the footage shows what you are describing, we have a major civil rights lawsuit. Byron sent the footage through a secure file transfer, and Michael called him back 20 minutes later after reviewing it twice. Byron, this is worse than I thought. Reed had no probable cause to stop you. He had no legal basis to demand identification. And he refused to verify your documents specifically because he had already decided you were guilty. Then he tried to arrest you without conducting even the most basic investigation. This is indefensible. Byron's voice stayed calm. What do we do? We file a formal complaint with the police department tonight. We file a federal civil rights lawsuit by the end of the week. And we make sure every member of your HOA board sees this footage so they understand that the officer they contracted with to protect the community has been harassing one of their own residents. Byron called an emergency meeting of the HOA board for the next evening, and all 7 board members attended. Byron showed them the footage without any commentary, letting them watch the entire interaction from start to finish. When the video ended, the room was silent for a long moment. Then Linda Morrison, the board's vice president and a white woman who had lived in Brookstone Estates for 15 years, spoke up. Byron, I am so sorry. That was absolutely unacceptable. That officer had no right to treat you that way. Another board member, Robert Chen, added, We hired the police department to protect this community, not to harass our residents. This is exactly the opposite of what we wanted. The board voted unanimously to terminate the contract with the police department effective immediately, and to support Byron in whatever legal action he decided to pursue. They also voted to send a formal letter to the police chief demanding an investigation into Officer Reed's conduct. Byron's attorney filed the formal complaint the next morning, and the police department opened an internal affairs investigation that same day. The investigator assigned to the case requested the security footage, and Byron provided it, along with a written statement describing everything that had happened. The investigation moved quickly because the evidence was overwhelming. The Internal Affairs Division pulled Officer Travis Reed's personnel file and patrol logs, and what they found made the situation significantly worse. Reed had been assigned to patrol Brookstone Estates for 3 months, and during those 3 months he had filed incident reports for 19 stops he had made within the community. The investigators cross-referenced those reports with the security camera footage that Byron's HOA system had been recording since it went live 2 weeks earlier, and they found something disturbing. In the 2 weeks the cameras had been operational, Reed had made 7 stops inside Brookstone Estates. 6 of those stops involved black drivers. Only 1 involved a white driver, and that stop lasted less than 3 minutes and resulted in no detention or questioning beyond a brief exchange. The 6 stops involving black drivers told a completely different story. Reed had detained each person for an average of 15 minutes. He had demanded identification in every case. He had questioned whether they lived in the community or had legitimate reasons for being there. And in 4 of the 6 cases, he had run background checks through dispatch even after the drivers had provided proof of residency. The footage showed a clear and undeniable pattern of racial profiling that had been going on for at least 2 weeks and likely much longer before the cameras were installed. The Internal Affairs investigator compiled the evidence and submitted a report recommending that Officer Travis Reed be terminated immediately for violating department policies on constitutional policing, engaging in racial profiling, and conducting unlawful stops without probable cause. 1 week after Byron was stopped in his own driveway, Officer Travis Reed was placed on administrative leave pending the outcome of the investigation. 2 weeks after that, he was fired. But Byron wasn't satisfied with just getting Reed fired. He wanted accountability that went beyond one officer losing his job. He wanted to make sure this never happened to anyone else. Byron's attorney filed a federal civil rights lawsuit seeking $1.4 million in damages for unlawful detention, racial profiling, violation of constitutional rights, and emotional distress. The case was assigned to a federal judge, and the city's attorneys reviewed the evidence and knew immediately that they had no defense. The city's legal team sat in a conference room 3 weeks after the lawsuit was filed, and the lead attorney assigned to defend the police department against Byron Tate's civil rights claim closed her laptop and looked at the other attorneys sitting around the table with an expression that made it clear there was no path to victory here. She had spent the past 2 days reviewing every piece of evidence Byron's attorney had submitted, and everything pointed to the same conclusion. Officer Travis Reed had racially profiled a homeowner in his own driveway, had violated his constitutional rights, and had done it all while being recorded on high-definition security cameras that captured every illegal action in perfect detail. The security footage was devastating. It showed Reed blocking Byron's driveway without any traffic violation or suspicious activity that would justify a stop. It showed Reed approaching with his hand on his weapon before Byron had even stepped out of his car. The audio captured Reed accusing Byron of trespassing without asking a single clarifying question first. It captured Reed threatening arrest for obstruction when Byron asked why he was being stopped. And most damning of all, it showed Reed looking at Byron's valid driver's license, vehicle registration, and insurance documents and calling them fake, without making any attempt to verify them through dispatch. The city's attorney had seen racial profiling cases before, but she had never seen one with evidence this clear and this comprehensive. Usually these cases came down to conflicting testimony, with the officer claiming one version of events and the civilian claiming another, and juries had to decide who to believe. But this case had no ambiguity. Everything Reed had done was documented on video with audio that left no room for interpretation. The attorney opened a second file that made the situation even worse. The Internal Affairs investigation into Officer Reed had uncovered a pattern that extended far beyond the single stop involving Byron Tate. Reed's patrol logs from his 3 months assigned to Brookstone Estates showed that he had made 19 documented stops within the community. The security camera footage that had been operational for the final 2 weeks of Reed's assignment showed that 6 of his 7 stops during that period involved black drivers, and all 6 of those stops included questioning about whether the drivers belonged in the neighborhood, demands for identification, and extended detentions that had no legal justification. But the pattern went back even further than Brookstone Estates. The Internal Affairs team had pulled Reed's entire personnel file, and what they found showed that this wasn't an isolated incident or even a recent development. Reed had been with the department for 8 years, and during those 8 years he had been the subject of 3 formal complaints from black residents, who claimed he had stopped them without cause, questioned them aggressively, and treated them like suspects based solely on their race. All 3 complaints had been investigated and dismissed with verbal warnings. The pattern had been documented, noted in his file, and then ignored by his supervisors, who allowed him to continue patrolling without any additional oversight or retraining. One of the complaints had come from a black doctor who had been stopped while driving through an affluent neighborhood on his way home from the hospital. Reed had pulled him over, accused him of driving a stolen vehicle, and refused to believe the doctor's explanation until backup arrived and verified his story. The complaint had been filed, Reed had received a verbal warning, and nothing else had happened. Another complaint had come from a black woman who had been stopped while jogging through a park in a predominantly white neighborhood. Reed had questioned her about why she was there, asked to see identification, and suggested she should jog in her own neighborhood instead. The complaint had been filed, Reed had received another verbal warning, and again nothing had changed. The third complaint had come from a black teenager who had been stopped while sitting in his car outside a friend's house in a suburban area. Reed had demanded identification, questioned whether the teenager had permission to be there, and searched the car without consent. The complaint had been filed, Reed had received his third verbal warning, and he had continued working without any consequences. The city's attorney looked at the other lawyers in the room and spoke the conclusion that everyone already knew. We can't win this case. The evidence is overwhelming. Reed profiled Mr. Tate based on race, violated his Fourth Amendment rights, and attempted to arrest him without probable cause. And the pattern in his personnel file shows this wasn't an isolated incident. The department knew Reed had a history of racial profiling and did nothing to stop it. If we go to trial, a jury is going to award damages that could be twice what they're asking for now. One of the other attorneys asked, "What are they seeking?" $1.4 million. The room went quiet. That was a significant settlement, but it was also less than what a jury might award if they saw the footage and heard about the pattern of complaints that had been ignored for years. The lead attorney continued, "I'm recommending we settle. Reed has already been terminated, so we can't offer that as a remedy. But we can offer the full settlement amount, a formal apology, and a commitment to policy reforms. If we fight this and lose at trial, we're looking at a bigger judgment, legal fees, and national media attention that will make the department look even worse than it already does." The decision was made within 24 hours. The city would offer Byron Tate the full $1.4 million settlement, along with a written acknowledgement that Officer Reed had violated his rights and that the department had failed to address Reed's pattern of racial profiling. The settlement would also include a commitment to implement new training protocols, establish an independent review board for complaints of racial bias, and conduct quarterly audits of all traffic stops to identify patterns of discriminatory behavior. Byron's attorney presented the offer to him 2 days later, and Byron sat in Michael's office reading through the settlement terms carefully. The money was significant, but Byron had never been motivated by the financial aspect of the lawsuit. What mattered to him was accountability and making sure this didn't happen to someone else. "They're admitting fault?" Byron asked. Michael nodded. "Not in those exact words, but the settlement language acknowledges that Reed violated your rights and that the department should have addressed his behavior earlier. They're also committing to reforms that will be monitored by an independent board. That's more than we usually get in these cases." Byron thought about it for a long moment, and then he signed the settlement agreement. Officer Travis Reed's termination became final. His personnel file was flagged to prevent him from being hired by another law enforcement agency, and his name became permanently attached to a case that would be taught in police academies as an example of how racial bias destroys careers and costs cities millions of dollars. The settlement was finalized 4 months after Officer Travis Reed stopped Byron Tate in his own driveway, and the $1.4 million payment was transferred to Byron's account, along with a formal letter from the city acknowledging that his constitutional rights had been violated and that the police department had failed to address Officer Reed's documented pattern of racial profiling. The letter was signed by the police chief, the city manager, and the mayor, and it included a commitment to implement the reforms that had been outlined in the settlement agreement. Byron donated $500,000 of the settlement to civil rights organizations that provided legal assistance to victims of police misconduct, used another $300,000 to establish a scholarship fund for students of color pursuing careers in law and criminal justice, and kept the remainder to cover his legal fees and compensate for the emotional distress of being treated like a criminal in his own driveway. The money was significant, but what mattered more to Byron was knowing that the reforms written into the settlement would be enforced and monitored by an independent oversight board that had the authority to audit police stops and hold officers accountable for discriminatory behavior. Officer Travis Reed was 36 years old when he was terminated, and his 8-year law enforcement career ended with a personnel file that documented 3 dismissed complaints of racial profiling, a termination for constitutional violations, and his name attached to a $1.4 million settlement that became national news. Reed applied to police departments in 4 neighboring counties. But every background check revealed the reason for his termination and the federal lawsuit that had resulted from his actions. No agency would hire him. He tried working private security, but when his employers discovered the viral security footage that showed him attempting to arrest a man in his own driveway, they terminated his employment. Reed eventually found work as a night shift supervisor at a warehouse, making less than half of what he had earned as a police officer, and his name remained permanently attached to training materials used in law enforcement academies across the country as an example of how racial bias destroys careers and costs taxpayers millions. The police department implemented sweeping changes in the months following the settlement. All officers were required to complete 40 hours of training on constitutional policing, implicit bias, and de-escalation techniques before being allowed to return to patrol duties. New protocols were established requiring officers to document specific probable cause for every traffic stop, and supervisors were required to review stop data monthly to identify any patterns of racial disparity. An independent civilian review board was created with subpoena power and the authority to investigate complaints of racial profiling without interference from the department. The reforms were monitored quarterly by a federal compliance officer, and the data showed results within the first year. Racially disparate stops decreased by 64% and complaints of racial profiling dropped by 72%. Brookstone Estates terminated its contract with the police department and hired a private security company that was explicitly trained on non-discriminatory practices and community engagement. The HOA used the security camera system that Byron had championed to monitor not just criminal activity but also to ensure that security personnel treated all residents with equal respect regardless of race. Byron remained president of the HOA board and became a sought-after speaker at other homeowners associations across the region, advising them on how to implement security measures that protected residents without enabling racial profiling. Byron used his platform to advocate for policy changes at the state level, working with legislators to pass laws that required all police departments to collect and publish data on traffic stops broken down by race, and that created civil penalties for departments that failed to address documented patterns of discriminatory policing. He testified before legislative committees, gave interviews to media outlets, and partnered with civil rights organizations to push for accountability measures that would prevent other black homeowners from being treated the way he had been treated. 5 years after the incident, Byron was still living in Brookstone Estates, still serving as HOA president, and still working at the same financial consulting firm where he had built his career. The security camera system he had installed continued to protect residents and document any instances of discriminatory treatment. Officer Travis Reed was still working warehouse jobs and living with the permanent stain of being the cop who racially profiled an HOA president and cost his city $1.4 million. And the case remained a landmark example cited in legal briefs, academic papers, and police training programs nationwide as proof that racial profiling in affluent communities carries severe consequences. The lesson was expensive, public, and permanent. Living in an expensive house while black should not invite suspicion. Security cameras protect residents from bad actors, including bad cops, and officers who make assumptions based on race rather than evidence will lose their careers, cost their cities millions, and have their names forever attached to the consequences of their bias. Byron never received a personal apology from Travis Reed, but he received something far more valuable: justice, systemic reform, and the satisfaction of knowing that his refusal to be silent had created protections that would benefit countless others who came after him. If you believe, a homeowner should be able to pull into his own driveway without being accused of trespassing. Share this story. What reforms do you think would prevent racial profiling in affluent neighborhoods? Drop your answer in the comments. And if this reminded you that black success should be celebrated, not treated as suspicious. Subscribe. We're not stopping until every person can live in the home they've earned without being treated like a criminal for it.